Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. Now, if you don't already know, there is a new academy by the rather wonderful Mr. Christian Kohle called the Kohle Audio Kult. And we're very excited because Ermin Hamidovic, a wonderful mastering engineer, who you probably know from some little bands like Periphery and many others, has done a course for the academy. So we're going to talk to him, not just about that, but also about the fact that as well as being a world-class mastering engineer, he also owns Submission Audio. So without further ado, let's chat with Ermin.
Thank you so much for that grand welcome, Warren. Thank you very much for pronouncing my name correctly. You are one of two people in history to ever do it the first time. It is you and Ola England. And again, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's an absolute pleasure to have worked with you and Christian on the mastering course as well. So I look forward to this.
I do like the fact that you're wearing a McLaren hat.
Yes, I'm repping my man, Ricky. He's having a bit of a hard time in the McLaren team right now. And I'm just showing solidarity and support because undoubtedly he's going to be watching this interview. Obviously, he's such an avid follower of audio production.
You don't happen to have like 10 or 20 of them singing in a garage, do you? You know?
Not quite. No, I'm afraid not.
Quite. We were saying that we reserve that for Misha. Sorry, Misha, giving you a shout out on the McLaren there. That's probably, if anybody does know you, they'll know you like, oh, wait there. I looked at that Periphery album and I remember seeing that guy's name.
I do owe it to the guys. They basically kickstarted my mastering career. And now that you mentioned Misha, inadvertently, it was actually him. Because back in 2014, I did a set of kind of just casual remasters for YouTube, just for my own personal sort of thing. And I put them online. And I asked my friend Nolly, who had just joined Periphery as their bass player, what he thought about the remasters, because these were Meshuggah remasters, so pretty kind of legendary metal band. And he happened to show them to Misha. And Misha just so happened to be looking for a mastering engineer for their brand new records at the time. So he basically threw me in the test array of the mastering engineers that tested for that one. And it went really well. And the rest is history. And we had a really good career come out of that.
That's a kind of a baptism of fire if ever I saw one.
I think anything worthwhile usually is. We always say when Misha and I talk, I forget what the saying is. It's like opportunity is like the conflux of like luck and having the ability at the right time. It's something like that. But essentially, you kind of need luck, but you need to have the ability at the right opportune moment that comes along. So it's like 50% luck, it's 50% ability, and you just kind of need to wait for your moment and kind of hope for the best. Sometimes that moment never comes and you spend your entire lifetime developing an ability or a business that never quite manages to capitalize. Sometimes you get lucky in that one moment like I did, and you end up with a really cool relationship with a really, really cool band for a long time.
People don't always understand that they've got opportunities. You know, there's things arrive and I'm like, you should be grasping this, and they're waiting for something better. You know, Periphery call you and say, will you master my album? You could be sitting there going, nah, I mean, they're good, but they're not the Foo Fighters, so I'm going to wait for that. You know, it's definitely taking every possible opportunity you can and working your hardest on it, because you don't know where the luck is going to come from, do you? Because you might do 20 albums and choose not to do one, and that one may have been the one that could have changed your life.
It doesn't go from you mixing at the corner pub one afternoon to working with Rihanna overnight. It doesn't really work that way. There's an in-between. And I think people see like a meteoric rise to success. And I'm talking about a different industry to metal, like way more pop and R&B oriented producers that just get massive gigs. They were in the right networks for the right time. Like, so they don't just kind of get in there. It's not like Rihanna's just walking around. It's like, I like the look of that guy or that chick. She's going to be my new like producer. You have to kind of embed yourself in the network. You have to know the right people. So I guess in my case, what you could say is, had I not been an avid community member of the Andy Sneap Forum, had I not met Nolly before he was in Periphery, I never would have had the network connection to get Misha to hear those casual remasters that I did, which ended up leading to that Juggernaut gig. So you have to position yourself in such a way as to maximize your opportunities. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't quite grasp, I suppose.
With mastering, are you entirely in the box? Do you use some hardware? Do you choose sometimes to only use? I mean, what's your process like?
If I was still a full-time mastering engineer, if I wasn't running a software company and a YouTube channel and all of these other things on the side, I may opt to have established a dedicated space when, the rack of the $100,000 worth of gear or whatever. But the return on investment for me just isn't there because it constitutes such a small part of my business and my daily life now. So part of the reason that we've gone increasingly more in the box, obviously the plugins are getting better and better and better. We are developing workflows that are better and better because we've had a lot more time with the plugins. We've had a lot more time to learn how to make them sound like the analog. We know how to use saturation plugins to emulate some of the warmth that we get from transformers, et cetera, et cetera. But above all, and I think you know this, Warren, like everybody else, you are going to be asked to make a revision anywhere from 6 months to 10 years from now on a record that you do tomorrow, right? And it's like your compressor might sound completely different. The caps may have leaked, it may have exploded once or twice in that time, and they want it to sound exactly the same. It's like the only way it's going to sound exactly the same is if I load up exactly the same bit perfect plugins. So here we are. It's definitely, I think, an arrangement of convenience more than anything, but the way that people move and the way that they work, it's simply just more tied into the modern process.
I know in the Kohle Audio Cult, you've done a full course on mastering, and I've got to be honest, I thought it was probably one of the best mastering courses I've ever watched. It's so succinct. Do you feel like education is just something that comes naturally to you, or did you work pretty hard at that?
Oh, that's an interesting point, and thank you very much for saying so. It's when you're creating something like this, you're not observing it from the outside like this. You're always wondering how it's going to be taken in by people. So you're always worried. You're like, man, am I rambling on? Am I giving them information that's useful? So I think it's one of those things that on some level has come somewhat naturally. Around 10 years ago, and I suppose as time has gone on, people may not remember me from this, I authored a book called The Systematic Mixing Guide. And that was actually my very first claim to whatever you want to call it, infamy in this metal part of the industry. And I think that was where we first established the idea of, hey, I really want to write this succinct technical manual that anybody can read, irrespective of their experience level. And as soon as they put it down after a couple of hours, they're going to go back to their mix and experience an immediate improvement. It doesn't matter where they were. They're going to have picked up something or several things that they can apply to this mix and immediately get a tangible benefit. And one thing that influenced me to operate in those terms was reading highly verbose 600-page technical manuals that completely drained my life and my motivation. And as somebody who's now partially a YouTuber as well, I understand the power of kinetic movement, the fact that you have to keep things moving along, keep people's interest, make sure that you kind of get them what they need to know as quickly as possible, waffle on as little as possible, and then just get to the good stuff. So I think that's kind of a principle I try to abide by in most things that we do, including plugin development as well.
Did you develop plugins out of a need? Did you feel like there was things that you were looking for? Or did you, and which is also just as valid, were you taking processes that were done with multiple plugins and combining them to one? Or a bit of both?
We began actually creating virtual basses. And I know that we've just gotten the Umansky bass across to you there, but one of the reasons that came about emergently. So with my business partner in Submission Audio, we were basically hanging around in his studio. This is something we used to do a lot in the 2010s, was try new techniques, try to become better engineers, work on our craft. And that was one of the best experiences of my professional life, because we had this studio available to us where we were just leveling up. Every single weekend we were leveling up. And one of those weekends, I happened to have my studio bass there, a Spectre Euro 5 LX, which I still love dearly and still have. And he said, hey, have you heard of this new thing called Zombase? I'm like, what's a Zombase? And he's like, oh, well, it's this new virtual instrument for bass. And I'm like, people are doing that? That's crazy. That's wild. Who would want a virtual bass? That's silly. And he showed me this Zombase thing, and it was obviously very primitive. And, it had a small round robin, and many of the notes were doubled up and pitch shifted to create the alternate notes. And I'm like, yeah, there's room to improve here. He's like, well, we've got the evening. Why don't we sample your Spectre, just one shot, all the notes on the fretboard, and see how it comes up? Basically, long story short, a week later, he had this compiled into a demo contact instrument. We heard it back, and I think we've never looked back since. That was the penny drop moment for me. I'm like, wow, what we've done here is extremely special. It sounds unbelievable. And I think this is something that people could get a lot of value out of. And then fast forward to 2018 was when we released our first flagship product, the Eurobass. And from then on, Submission Audio was essentially created as people know it.
So when you get somebody sending you an album to master, what is your sort of thought process? Do you listen to all of the songs together and try and get a cohesive vision of what would work on all of the songs? Or you just launch into a song, get it sounding great, and then try and copy that feel from one song to another? What's your What's your process like?
One thing we can use as a reference is actually the project that I was working on for Christian's course. So it's a really good case in point because I work with Josh from Silosis very, very closely. He's from the old Sneakboard days. We're both extremely pedantic about the details. So our emails would explode the minds of regular mortals because we are just obsessing over 0.01 dB changes. And I think it's one of those things that will just drive people absolutely mental, but it's what we live for. So basically, he'll send me through usually a track, and then that same track broken down into stems. He'll be like, "Look, Ermin, I've spent however many months on this obsessing. Now it's your turn to obsess for me. Like, listen to the track, let me know what it needs, break it down into stems, let me know whatever." Right? So I'll break it down and be like, "Okay, so you've got the kick eating up too much of the space. The bass guitar needs to go more into the subs or whatever," and we'll kind of take a look at it in batches, back and forth. So that is the kind of idyllic mastering process for me when it comes to a high level kind of over-engineered record. That is a best case scenario where the mix engineer has done his absolute best and he's gone, "Look, give me everything that you have on top and let's make this an amalgam of the pinnacle of both of our abilities, technical abilities." So we'll do that. And then eventually the rest of the record will come in. Now, if it's a regular record, there'll be variants from song to song, invariably, even just the strings deadening over time. Let's say a lot of people who engineer these days don't understand that bass strings only last about 4 hours, 4 to 8 hours before they, kind of lose that newness and whatever. So that will create a tonal shift even without the mix changing whatsoever. So what I'll generally aim to do is I will isolate the songs that I think are mixed the quote unquote best of the entire record. I will base the bulk of the mastering processing around those songs, batch them together, and then I will listen to the rest and adjust as necessary. So if one may have, let's say, sloppier subs due to the fact that they, haven't refreshed the strings, or maybe they let the bass drum detune itself over time, and it's like now it's hitting at, 65 hertz instead of 73 hertz, that kind of stuff all plays a part. So you kind of just adjust from song to song to song, and then you try to unify it as much as possible so it sounds like the one record and that the songs all kind of belong on the one playlist together.
I suppose I have to ask this question. Do you have any kind of template way of working? Are you going to be honest enough to say yes if you do?
Oh, yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I'll be honest about this because I don't really master day to day anymore. So I've got nothing to lose on that one. But I have a template of a bunch of gear that often goes onto my masters loaded onto the master chain every single time I pull in a session. Now, not all of those are enabled. They're there as options. So I may want the SSL style compressor on one project. I may want the whatever the Focusrite Red style one on another, or the whatever the Fairchild, et cetera, et cetera. Might want a Pultec EQ on one. Might want a Maselec EQ on another. It all depends. And ultimately, as a mastering engineer, it's one of the few places where you can template. You can have your favorite gear. You can have your rack of like your favorite gear, like many mastering engineers do. You have to adjust that gear on a per project basis. There is no template mentality for mastering. Every single project is going to require completely different moves. If you try to do the same thing to everything, if you have like a template EQ curve, it's just going to be absolutely awful because you're going to get some projects that are too sizzly, too much of that digital thing, the cymbals are distorting. You have to kind of dull that down as much as possible. Others are going to be what I call undercooked, which is ones that aren't overmixed. So they'll be very flat. You'll need to maybe reduce, that flat mid-range around 600 hertz, maybe brighten up the brilliance and stuff like that. So they're completely different processes from project to project. So yeah, you can have your favorite gear. You can have it there ready to go. It saves a lot of time, especially having it on settings often work, but it still doesn't get around you needing to really get in there and do the 0.1 dB changes.
I asked a question maybe 6 months ago, like what is the thing you have most problem with? 20% of people said mixing low end.
Yep.
It's got a lot to do with the fact that people probably are in environments where they can't hear low end, either using headphones or small speakers in small rooms without subs, and also being in rooms that don't reproduce that or don't accurately reproduce it.
Having been someone who mastered full-time for about half a decade, by far the most predominant issue we got through was excessive sublow that people just left in the mixes. And my assumption is that they never heard it because their reproduction system could not reproduce beneath 60 or 50 hertz. And then the room compounds that issue as well because there's just nulls and peaks everywhere. So it's just absolute chaos down there.
There was a whole movement, sorry to interrupt you, there was a whole movement of videos about 5 or 6 years ago. It was like, stop high passing so much. And I started asking my mastering engineer friends, and they're like, the mixes have got worse. Where suddenly we've got all this like terrible low end definition. All the guitars have this, everything's rumbling, and it was like people were saying, stop the high pass madness, like you're high passing too much. And all that happened was like none of my friends could get a kick drum or a bass guitar to come out because everything was just blah, 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 blah.
I feel personally targeted by that because anyone that's read the mixing guide or followed any of our mixing tutorials will see that I high pass everything. I literally high pass every track. Well, that's the nature of mixing. You're trying to band limit the element that you're mixing so that it fits into its own specific range because you only have 20,000 frequencies to deal with, and you can't put everything in each of those 20,000 frequencies, right? So it's only logical. I think we're still seeing the knock-on effects from that because before I stopped mastering day to day, one of the things I was seeing more and more and more was this fascination for the sub harmonizers, for like the sub low enhancers. Like a bass drum would just be smashing 40 hertz, and this is in a record that's got like blast beats and double bass. And I'm like, do you understand like that frequency takes time to develop? Like unless you're doing 4 on the floor, you got nowhere for 40 hertz to go. Like your kick has to exist between like 60 and 80 hertz if you're doing speed metal. You can't be doing this kind of dub sort of stuff. So I think mixing, as you probably know, you've been around doing this for a while as I have, is that it goes through fashions. It goes through
sure.
Yeah, so one era people love sub low, in another era people love high mids, in another era everybody cranks the highs way too much, and it's like we had the loudness wars, we had whatever the hell else we went through. We had the digital guitar wars in the 2000s in metal. Everybody was using pods and pod XTs and stuff, and then we moved on from there to the Axe FXs, and then from the Axe FXs to the Kempers, and then throughout the entire time, ultimately, as much as the digital stuff was developing, a tube amp still sounded as good in 1990 as it does in 2022, right? So if you kind of know the fundamentals, if you know what it is that you're looking for, you can kind of have that timeless quality to what you're working on. But you need to kind of break away from the fashions. So as soon as you see this kind of hysteria, like stop the high passes, or always do this on your mix, always boost 3K, or always compress mid-side or something like that, you know that it's a fashion that somebody's trying to push as a bit of a hype train, right? So just if I can say anything from like 20 years of doing this stuff is when I look back, just try to be sensible. The more sensible you are, the happier you'll be when you look back on your body of work.
So you are a mastering engineer that's moved in far more entrepreneurial. You've moved into developing your own software, etc. How do you manage everything? Because we're in a world now where there's so much stuff coming at us, all the social media that we have to continually be trying to deal with. Plus, you're designing products. How do you handle it all?
Same as you, Warren, just like running headlong into a hurricane, trying to hold on to my cap, figuratively speaking, and just trying to make it all fit together as well as possible. It's so funny transitioning from a service-based role into one that's more admin or management related, because there's a complete change of pace. Your tasks are no longer serialized. It's not like you wake up and are like, okay, let me check my emails. My client's telling me to tell this to turn the snare up, and it's like, no more turning snares up, no more like adjusting the kick. It's like, hey, this guy needs this thing, otherwise he can't work on project A. Employee, X can't speak to employee Z for reasons, and then therefore this project is now halted. All right, we must create a network with institution A in order to launch product C. Otherwise, we don't have the platform that we need for people to see it. So there's always these new, interesting challenges. There's all of this networking. There's all of this management. There's all of this dealing with human capital, as well as the fact that you're dealing with, actual capital and products and deadlines and project management as well. So it's a lot more chaotic. But for someone like me, if you have the temperament for it, it's a lot more exciting at the same time. So if you like your life being a little bit more eventful, it certainly makes life a little bit more interesting. Like, how do you feel about it personally? Obviously, you're running as many, if not way more enterprise than I am. So how does it work on your side?
I think a lot of the time, the answer is only just. I like the challenge. I really enjoy working hard. I like being busy, to be honest. I grew up quite poor in a very wealthy area. So it gave me a big chip on my shoulder, but I also have that feeling that the other shoe's going to drop. So if I'm not doing multiple things and I'm not trying to grow and evolve and get better at things, then I assume that it's all going to fall apart. And there's so much incredible opportunity out there for people like us that work really hard. This is my social life. My friends are us. The people
Sure.
like us and I'm happy with that.
There's a lot of similarity there between us. And I think it creates a temperament where if you're always hungry and you always feel like it might collapse because you know what the other side of it looks, you know what it's like to be destitute, you know what it's like to struggle in life, you never want to go back to that. So it is, for the longest time in my life, I was kind of bummed about that sort of stuff because I grew up very poor also. But I've come to realize in adulthood that it was the greatest gift I ever could have been given, because that hunger is never going to go away. That drive to do new things is just innate because you understand, where it all kind of came from. And I would say that not many people probably know this about me, but it's probably a big part of why all of these kind of institutions and stuff on whatever businesses exist now. But I was actually born in former Yugoslavia back in the late 80s. So one of the formative experiences of my life was that I experienced the breaking apart of that republic as the Serbian army were essentially invading my country. So one of my formative memories of life was of running for my life and my family losing all of their property. So when that is like deep seated in you, when that becomes like the foundational bedrock of who you are as a person, you fundamentally see life very differently to somebody who's come up in the middle class suburbs. So I would say to this, I would imagine that if this is being seen mostly in the Western world, there's going to be a few people with similar experiences to ours, but by and far, most people are going to have grown up in relatively comfortable middle class sort of suburban lives. If you come from that kind of a background, find your hunger. Like, even though you may not have had the experience of being on the other side, maybe listen to people who have, look at people around you who are struggling and try to isolate elements of that you never really want to go to in your own life, and then use that as a fountain of motivation to push yourself forward. Because one of the hardest things to do in the face of all the adversity that you find when you try to start new businesses, because you're facing so much failure, is get the gusto to keep going. It's that classic Muhammad Ali. I think it's a Muhammad Ali quote, or it's a classic boxing quote. Oh no, it's a Rocky quote of all things. It's life isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and get up and keep going, right? And that There's so much timeless wisdom in that. As much as it may be a cliched Hollywood movie, it's a classic movie for a reason. There's a lot of foundational wisdom there.
Welcome to the Kohle Audio Cult. My name is Ermin, and I've been working with metal bands as a producer and engineer for nearly 20 years. In 2014, I transitioned to full-time mastering, and that's what we'll be covering today. In this course, we'll be going over what mastering actually is, dispelling misconceptions, getting you familiar with different formats, workflow, and finally showing how you can use powerful, entirely in-the-box chains to master your music. We'll be analysing 5 mixes provided by Kohle Audio Cult members and then picking one to take through the mastering process together. After this, I'll be showing you a world-class mastering process thanks to a track provided by my friend Josh from Silosis. Okay, so let's run through the typical digital plugin chain that I'll use in a completely ITB master. As we stipulated at the beginning of this course, this is to showcase the power of modern-day completely software-based mastering. So generally speaking, I'll begin with a broad strokes, tonal palette sort of broad aesthetic shaping EQ that I'll pull up as much for its saturation or its general sound as I will for the actual sound of the filter shapes. I tend to like the Acoustica Audio EQs for this a lot due to their own proprietary Volterra kernel based modeling technology. So you can think of them as dynamic impulse responses. To me, it captures the essence of analog EQs better than any other plugin manufacturer on the market currently, so I tend to like these to open up with. It's a really good way to inject some flavor into the master before we move on to the corrective portion. So the corrective portion can be handled with a bunch of different EQs. I have Crave EQ here. You can use FabFilter's Pro Q3, the old Sony Oxford EQs, DMG Audio Equality. I mean, the sky's the limit. Whatever works for you, so long as it's a flexible digital corrective EQ. Now, the reason that we're running it through these two processes is that we're trying to make the mix more portable and essentially prepared for the broadband compressor section. I tend to be a big fan of the old SSL bus compressor style compression. 90% of the time on metal, that tends to work for me really, really well. Whether it be FG Gray, the Townhouse is really, really good. Whether it be the analog GSSL, Allen Smart, or whatever, but we're not dealing with the analog in this test. Ultimately, you can use whatever you want. You can use Fairchild style compression. You can use old Opto style. You can use FET style. You can do like Focusrite Red style. This is really where you showcase your own personality as a mastering engineer. Obviously, there are some high-grade mastering analog EQs you can pick up if you really want to take this seriously, but a really good starting point is something like the BX Townhouse bus compressor on sale. It's very, very cheap, and it's very, very flexible and very, very easy to dial as well, as we'll get into once we start the actual mastering process. After this, we move on to the saturation section. Now, as strange as it may be, my favorite saturator for mastering purposes is Saturn II. Not necessarily because of its tone or because of the algorithm underneath it, but because of its tonal flexibility. I'll show you how I dial this once we begin the actual mastering process. After the saturation, we move on to the actual maximizer portion. As you can see, I'll load up a bunch of different options. The one that we'll be spending the majority of our time on, of course, is Flatline. That would be my company's Clipper style maximizer. Now, one of the great things about Flatline is behind the scenes, we're always working on new feature additions, one of which currently is intelligent maximization algorithms. So for people that want something that's more set and forget, clip resistant, and kind of more modern in nature, as much as I might think the old sounds of the bee's knees, we're actually going to offer that in due time as well. So this is why we'll be using Flatline as our flagship mastering maximizer for these mastering demos. Here is the Weiss, which I occasionally pull up for really brutal down-tuned material. The Ozone is a classic that I've used for many, many years. And of course, the Pro L2, which is probably the most ubiquitous limiter in the modern industry that everybody seems to either mix or master into these days. And the digital clipping you shouldn't worry about because that's just a loopback, so you can actually hear what I'm running through in the DAW. The reason that I've chosen this Wintertide track is because it's fairly representative of a reasonable delivery spec when it comes to day-to-day mastering. It's not obnoxiously out, it's just kind of a little bit dull, it's a little bit flat, but the low end sounds like it's been well controlled and the mix sounds quite in balance with itself, which makes it a really good candidate for mastering because we should be able to pull out some pretty hefty moves but still maintain some pretty strong mix integrity. So we'll be working against the flatness, trying to add some air and sizzle in there, and also opening up the low end a little bit, so it should be pretty fun. If you want to hear this master at every single stage of processing you can, I'll be exporting it post-EQ, raw, post-EQ and compression, post-EQ and maximization. You'll be able to kind of follow along with my moves at every part of the process for when you try and match this master yourself. So I think a really good candidate to open up with here will be one of my favorite EQs, the Ivory M2. This tends to be very sizzly the moment you throw the pre in. It can subdue the low end a little bit, which sometimes can work against you, but I'll take a listen and see whether this is the way to go or not. I mean, it does the right thing to the highs. It might maybe neuter the lows a little bit too much, but we'll see how we go. We'll set it up to be a shelf starting about 12K. That should be quite sizzly. Okay, so opening up the highs, making them a little bit more glassy is a good first step, but there's obviously a lot more work to be done here. I don't really want to do it through boosts though. From what I can hear, got to get it out of there. But let's start at about 2 dB. Wow. Bear in mind, when it comes to the Ivory M2, it's a lot more aggressive than the controls would suggest. So plus 1 dB there on the low end is actually significantly more than that. So this record, or this song rather, is quite neutered in the sub low end.
Well, this has been fantastic talking to you. I really, really appreciate it. Everybody check out Christian Kohle's Audio Cult. So it's the Kohle Audio Cult, because Ermin is in there with an amazing, amazing mastering course. So check it out. There will be a link below. You can also check out all of Submission Audio links down below for all of the incredible plugins. And of course, Ermin's channel's down there. And I can't thank you enough. It's been great being able to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Warren. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a pleasure working on the mastering course with Christian as well. And I can't wait to see that come out and see how the community responds to it.
Thank you ever so much. Thanks, everyone. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios.